Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 38B, The History of the Pardon, with Kimberly Wehle. I'm excited to welcome Kim Wehle to the show today. Kim is a law professor, legal contributor for ABC News, and author of the new book, Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why, which is fantastic, because the history, power, and use or misuse of the pardon is something I've been wanting to unpack for some time, especially as we get to modern presidencies. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thanks for having me, Kenny. I'm so happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. And let's start with, what is the pardon? What can and can't you pardon? How's it work?
So a pardon is the executive in most places, that is the president or a governor's ability to basically say, I forgive your crime to someone who's been in the criminal justice system. The effects of that can be anywhere from basically wiping your record clean to just shortening a sentence. But it really is one branch of government intervening and overriding the other two branches of government. So under the U.S. system, legislatures will make the criminal laws, the judicial system will adjudicate violations, juries will decide, judges will issue sentences, and the pardon power lets the executive, the president, come in and just, with a stroke of a pen, wipe the whole thing away.
It's an incredible power. And we know the founding fathers were both Englishmen and huge Roman history nerds. So I'm curious, does the pardon power originate in either of those places? Where'd it come from?
The pardon power has been around since the Code of Hammurabi. It is in the Roman Empire. It's, of course, famously in the Bible, where Jesus and a murderer named Barabbas were put before Pontius Pilate on a holiday, and the Pontius Pilate could pardon one or the other, and the crowd demanded, crucify him, and chose the pardon for Pontius Pilate. And of course, it was also from common law England, and that's really where the framers of the Constitution borrowed the pardon power from, that kings could pardon, starting in the 7th century, pardon crimes in England. But the criminal justice system, Kenny, was very different then than now. And it was different when the framers kind of ratified the Constitution and brought the pardon power into the United States. Its moorings are not how it's functioning today. They're not consistent with what we understand it to be today.
How fascinating. I'm so excited to unpack that. But I'd love to push deeper on this. So when the founding fathers created it, and they said, we're going to take a power that a king has, and we're going to give it to a president, was there any pushback against the pardon in particular?
Yeah, well, there was some idea that it could be used to entrench power, that there could be abuses of the pardon power. There was a proposal to add language that would refuse pardons or ban pardons for treason, for example. There was discussion of requiring that the Senate actually agree to a pardon. There was discussion as to whether the pardon should only be for crimes that are actually there's been a conviction. I think it was Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who together really believed that the pardon power is needed because there are miscarriages of justice, and that impeachment, and of course I'm paraphrasing, impeachment is there to rein in rogue presidents, and that this exercise of mercy is necessary in what can be an unjust system, and that it should be unfettered. A real belief in the integrity, I think, of the person who would hold the office of the president, and the concern that it could be abused, I think, went by the wayside. But all things being equal, there was not a lot of discussion at the ratification conventions around the pardon power. It was just sort of adopted, with the exception for impeachments, which was something that was existing under English law at the time as well.
Got it. So the founders created this pardon power, they gave it to the president, and George Washington got to be the first president to show us how it's done, so to speak. What precedents did Washington establish around when and how to use the pardon and when not to?
So he pardoned the people who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion, where, after the Revolutionary War, we were broke, and so there was a tax that was placed on whiskey distillers, and they rose up and rebelled, and he was praised for pardoning them all. So this gets to the second prong of the rationale behind the pardon power. I mentioned the idea of mercy. And if I could go back to that first just for a moment, the origins of the pardon power. So back in common law England, and even before that, in Roman times, and even in ancient texts, most of sort of what we now know as criminal justice was meted out by private parties. We've all in America heard of the Hatfields and McCoy kind of concept, and the idea was the honor of your family required that you mete out justice, and that a crime was actually committed against the person or the family, right? And so this created this cycle of violence that went on and on and on from generation to generation. And at some point, English kings stepped in and said, no, actually, a crime is against me as sovereign. And it sort of intervened to shift the victim of a crime to the crown, which then gave the crown the prerogative, the authority to step in and settle things. So the king would go in and issue pardons in the context where the cycle of violence would otherwise not stop. In addition, unlike under our Constitution, there wasn't, and these are later amendments to the Constitution, there wasn't really an established criminal justice system. There really wasn't one at the time of the framing either. And what do I mean by that? Where we've got prosecutors, we've got rules of evidence, we have a criminal code that's passed by the legislature, we have the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendments protecting criminal defendants from overreach. We have bail. We have in the American system, for many defendants, not all criminal defendants, you get assistance of counsel. You have juries. You have appeals. All of these rights are in place to effectively ensure or protect against miscarriages of justice. The pardon kind of swept in when that didn't exist. And so in common law England, the execution was a common punishment for a lot of petty crimes. And so I talk about, I think in the 1200s, a story of a young child, a girl that mistakenly pushed her brother into boiling water and he died. And the father pled to the king for a pardon because otherwise that child was going to be thrown at the mercy of the criminal justice system, which could lead to some severe punishments. So that's the context that was brought into ratification of the Constitution. No discussion about that. But the one legitimate objective, of course, as I said, is mercy, fairness in an unjust system. The second objective, and this gets back to your question on George Washington, is amnesty. Okay, so that's the second, I think, traditional reason for using the pardon power, where Washington comes in and says, "Listen, we want to tamp down the rebellion after the revolution. We need to have, some coherence and some calm in the Union." And he was celebrated for that. So he set this precedent of presidents using the pardon power. It's a combination showing mercy to the rebels, but also sending a message, listen, we are a coherent union and I'm in charge. And there have been since then, John Adams, President Lincoln, President Jimmy Carter pardoned the people who dodged the Vietnam War draft. So there's a long history of pardons for amnesty, and I argue in the book that that is something that I think should probably be codified or at least certainly preserved. And my critiques of the pardon power don't lend itself to that amnesty, but that's not where the abuses really show up.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent description. And it's funny, now in my mind, I'm like, oh, so the pardon is like a legal dinosaur, that's just been around and everything around it's evolved. And you're like, why is there a Triceratops over there? I don't know. It's the pardon.
Yeah, and also, I mean, just as another aside, most crimes in the United States happen under state law, not under federal law. And there's only 3 states plus the District of Columbia that have unlimited power lodged in the governor. Most states, the vast majority of states, it's commissions or committees or it's shared with other parts of government. Some of these commissions, these pardon commissions, have regular people. They have a panoply of people that are on the committee, people from law enforcement, people from maybe a religious background, people from communities. The idea being, this is what in Roman times you had to get, I think, 6,000 signatures for the community to issue a pardon. And the idea was that it's the community that decides decides, okay, we're going to give this person a break. There's really very little modern precedent, even across the globe, for this unlimited, no appeals, no checks and balances, king-like power. In fact, even in England, there's no such thing as a pardon anymore. You can commute sentences, and it actually is not done unilaterally by the Queen. So our pardon power for the president is much, much more robust and king-like than even Prince Charles has today in the United Kingdom.
Fascinating. Okay, so we create the pardon, we give it to Washington. He uses it pretty judicially in an amnesty way. When does it start to go off the rails?
Gosh, that's a good question. It seems to really gone off the rails in the 20th century. The primary, examples of it, of course, are the most, I think, famous is President Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. I'm not saying that's off the rails. That was, I think, done in part for amnesty. The idea being, listen, the country had to heal after Watergate, but he got a lot of criticism for it. And in that moment, there hadn't even been an indictment of Richard Nixon. So that created this weird precedent. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in any case law where you can pardon people even if they haven't been indicted. It broadened the pardon power. I think where real egregious abuses seem to catch the public eye, potential abuses, where George H.W. Bush pardoned a bunch of people in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal in which he was involved and President Reagan was involved. And there's some criticism that by doing those pardons, he essentially killed any investigation into his own potential misconduct. There was President Clinton, who pardoned his own brother-in-law, but also pardoned a lot of donors, a huge slew of pardons on his last day of office. And he wrote an op-ed, I think it was in the Washington Post and the New York Times years later, saying he regrets that because it tarnished his reputation. So he believed there was some political pushback, or at least it's perceived political pushback. Barack Obama, surprisingly, issued some of the, he was a president who issued some fewest pardons of many presidents. Like, he didn't do very many, not any real serious controversial pardons. Chelsea Manning, the WikiLeaks, he pardoned her. So, and there was some criticism there. But of course, Donald Trump was the corrupt pardon extraordinaire. There were many pardons, or a number of pardons anyway, that you would say would fall within the category of mercy-based pardons. One that I talk about in the book only came about because Kim Kardashian got involved. This woman who was imprisoned. She had lost her son. She had some drug problems. She was engaged in some drug transactions. 10 co-defendants pled guilty. She got an extraordinarily long sentence. Obama's administration denied her pardon 3 times. Kim Kardashian intervened, and Donald Trump gave her a pardon. But Donald Trump also famously, pardoned Roger Stone, pardoned Paul Manafort, people involved in the Russian interference in the 2016 election, to the point where Stone's pardon even prompted a federal judge to say on the record that, and I'm paraphrasing, she thought there was corruption involved in that pardon, and many others. But Donald Trump, unlike his predecessors, bypassed to a large degree the system for asking for federal pardons through the pardon attorney in the Justice Department, and really was handing out pardons to people with access. He wasn't the first, but he was probably the most prominent. And there were also reports that, Rudy Giuliani was running around offering to sell pardons for $2 million.
You've reminded me of so many things I'd forgotten.
Yeah.
So the modern presidency, like, you hit so many examples I want to go a little deeper on, because it really is, it seems like the pardon just changes. And let's start with that Nixon pardon. So Nixon, he's facing likely impeachment in the Senate. He resigns over Watergate. Vice President Ford becomes president, and then Ford pardoned Nixon of all crimes he may have committed in office. You mentioned how that part, like, he hasn't even been convicted. That part's novel. Is there anything else that was novel, unprecedented, or out of the blue about that pardon?
Well, I mean, he was not even convicted. He wasn't even charged. These were just, if you committed a crime while you were in office. I think it was probably unusual because Nixon is the most recent in our collective memory of a president who committed crimes in office, next to allegedly Donald Trump, the more recent one. So I think the pardon power, and we can talk about this, is really wrapped up in many issues around the legitimacy and vitality and viability of American democracy moving forward, particularly when you look at it next to the court's immunity decision. And the book actually, John Dean, who's White House counsel for Richard Nixon, who famously told Congress there's a cancer on the White House. He ended up actually serving some time for his role in Watergate. He writes in his foreword that, those crimes that Richard Nixon committed would all be covered now under the modern Supreme Court conservative majority's immunity decision. So, Kenny, there might not be a need for pardons anymore if presidents can just commit crimes with impunity and there's nothing to pardon.
Well, at least we took one controversy off the books.
I guess so. We made a bigger king. So, but yeah, I like your optimism.
Thanks. Did anybody try to challenge Ford's pardon Nixon? And can you challenge a pardon? Can anybody say, wait, like you said, he hasn't been charged yet. Can I try to charge him? This is kind of crazy.
Well, there were challenges there were congressional hearings on the Clinton pardons. So there has been some historical oversight of pardons, but there isn't a lot of case law. So there was no challenge to the Nixon pardon that made its way into a reported case anyway. If it's happened, it's kind of buried in the annals of court dockets, and that's in part because who's the person that has standing to complain about a pardon?
That's a great point.
So you can't get into court unless you have what's called standing.
Yeah.
There have been people who have been pardoned who, like Jimmy Hoffa, the famous Teamsters sort of gang kind of, he's infamously had mafia connections. John Dean talks about Jimmy Hoffa's pardon that he actually drafted. Hoffa was pardoned. He was tried multiple times and convicted, and he was given a pardon with the condition that he not engage in union activities moving forward. And then later he sued, claiming that condition on his pardon was unconstitutional. He lost, and then while it was going on appeal, he infamously disappeared, and no one knows where he is. But so people who have been pardoned and there are limits on pardons, or problems with pardons or constraints on pardons, they'll come, or they want to be. There's actually one case in which someone was sentence was commuted from execution to life in prison, and then the Supreme Court case law relating to his criminal conviction shifted, and he wanted actually to be back on death row.
Right. Yeah.
And the court said no. So regular citizens don't have an ability to go to court and challenge a pardon. I do talk about the due process clause a little bit. Yeah. I think there's an opportunity for someone else who's been convicted and is similarly situated to someone who has a pardon to say, listen, it's unfair. I mean, I should get one if it's very arbitrary, Kenny, but those cases haven't gone anywhere in a notable way.
And the last question I got on this Ford-Nixon pardon is Ford rationalized his pardon by saying that to accept the pardon was an admission of guilt. Has the pardon always been viewed that way? Is it a novel interpretation? Are there non-guilty pardons? Where'd that come from?
There's some sort of language in case law dating back to the Civil War where that... and I say language because it's not an exact holding. It's not actually the law. And others have said, no, that's not the case. I think legally it's a distinction without a difference because different kinds of pardons, or what we call clemency, can have different implications. So you can have a pardon that just says, you're back in the saddle 100%. You can adopt children. You can vote. your criminal record is wiped clean. You can have any job. But there are other pardons that are more limited. I talked about conditional pardons. There are also pardons that just shorten your sentence or give you what's called a reprieve. So say you're pregnant, and so the pardon can be until you have your child, and then you go back to prison, or you get out early. There are a whole panoply, and it really varies under state law how the pardon functions. But I think what you're getting at is really a matter of common sense, Kenny, which is if you didn't do anything wrong, why do you need a pardon? And on that, I've got to go back to January 6th again, and the fact that 6 sitting members of Congress, and they were sitting at the time, I don't know if they still are, I haven't gone back to check, 6 sitting members of Congress asked Donald Trump for pardons in connection with January 6th. And so I think politically, we should be paying more attention to pardons. And do we really want people to hold office, to be in positions of power, who would be seeking pardons for their actions in connection with that office?
Absolutely. And you ran through the modern list from Nixon on, of Bush Sr., pardoning the Iran-Contra guys, Clinton, but you didn't mention Bush Jr., he pardoned Scooter Libby, which was another one, you got Trump, so on. Is this as bad as it looks? Let's just elaborate on that point. How concerning really is this?
I think it's very concerning. There's no ban in the Constitution on pardons in exchange for bribes. Give me money and I will give you a pardon. There are limits on lobbyists going to members of Congress. They have to register if they're a lobbyist. There's all kinds of disclosure rules, but there are no constraints on lobbying presidents for pardons. Jared Kushner's dad, whom former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said was one of the most despicable criminals he ever prosecuted, was pardoned by Donald Trump. And reportedly, I think Kushner denies it, but he was the clearinghouse for an avalanche of pardon requests late in office. And I think the question really is are presidents in the position to pardon people that are into their silence? Paul Manafort, when he was in the criminal justice system, Donald Trump tweeted praise for being quiet, things like that. Right. So are pardons being dangled in exchange for obstruction of justice, for silence? Could presidents sell pardons? Could presidents give nuclear secrets in exchange for something like a pardon? Other things of value that only presidents have. We certainly, Kenny, have seen people who commit white-collar crimes, some despicable ones. I mean, there are examples for Donald Trump, people that bilked, the elderly, in connection with Medicare or, elder care facilities, really despicable people that would shock the conscience getting pardons if they can, they somehow get access. They have money to make campaign contributions. They have money to pay high-profile lawyers to lobby the president. Pardons, if they're for mercy, it really should be for I think last count, something like 7 to 9 million people that are in prisons in the United States. There's statistics that suggest that upwards of 20,000, there's evidence that they're actually innocent. I mean, I argue in the book, pardons should be for the innocent. It's not even one of the criteria the Justice Department uses in considering pardons, is whether there's innocence. So there's all kinds of incentives for rich and powerful people who get caught to go to presidents and say, listen, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. And how does that serve the public interest? It does not, Kenny. It absolutely doesn't.
When a president or presidential candidate shows a willingness to pardon anyone who broke the law on their behalf, what does that do to our justice system and our political system?
Well, we've heard a lot recently, no one's above the law, no one's above the law, and that's been corroded most recently by the Supreme Court. I think if writ large, what people don't, I think, really understand is there are other parts of the world where the criminal justice system and the legal system does not work, right? That you get someone to show up at your house that's been robbed if you have enough money to pay a bribe. That laws are optional. Even traffic laws are optional, that you kind of have to do a lot and keep it into your own hands. So I think the broader problem with corruption at this level, potentially in broad daylight and expanding with the with the immunity, in conjunction with the immunity, is just a degradation of our system of laws itself, and that's not good. That's bad. Americans don't like, they're upset about the idea of, I think the misinformation that crime has increased in the current administration, but they don't want crime increasing, and
Right.
they shouldn't want it at the top levels of government. And it also just, I think, diminishes trust in our institutions, and that's already really suffering. And if we don't trust government, then we don't trust each other. We don't trust, we the people. It's really a slippery slope and quite corrosive and concerning.
Yeah, I've always thought, the government's just us. It's just people. It's just your neighbors. Really?
I love that. I should use that. I mean, this happened in the 2020 election where people are like, all kinds of fraud. I'm like, well, the people that administer that are, your teachers, your neighbors, your doctors.
They're not like
your
a bunch of
friends.
Martians who live somewhere else.
And they're not a bunch of fraudsters either.
Yeah.
They're just, a lot of them just do it out of their civic duty. I mean, we need constraints on people in power because the framers understood it's human nature to amass, entrench, and abuse power. So we have to have limits.
This next question is in some parts nullified by, as you said, the Supreme Court ruling that presidents are kind of immune to what they do in office. But let's say that a president wanted to pardon themselves for something maybe they'd done out of office, given that ruling. Can presidents pardon themselves? I've heard this question asked many times. People always debate it. What have you seen? What is your insight on this idea? Can a president pardon themselves?
Well, I argue in the book that the answer should be no, but let me just, the lawyer in me here, let me just make a distinction around the question.
Sure.
I think the question is less can they, and more if they do, what happens.
Great.
Right?
Great. Yes. Great point.
So that's the thing. People ask me all the time, is it constitutional? Can a president do that? Can Congress do that? The question really is, if they do it,
Yes.
is there a consequence?
Yes.
And if there's no consequence, the answer to the first question is yes, they can. So it's really about, that's what the whole separated powers and the system of checks and balances is about. So there is no precedent there's no Supreme Court case. It doesn't say anything in the Constitution of whether presidents can pardon themselves. The framers at the ratification of the Constitution didn't discuss it. So we don't have any definitive answer one way or the other. Many legal experts will say, there's a sort of an old adage. It's also not anywhere in the Constitution, but that someone should not be the judge in their own case. The idea that you decide whether you did something wrong, and that, of course, you're always going to say, no, I didn't do anything wrong. So there's an incentive, essentially, if the president can self-pardon, to just pardon themselves for everything. And then there is no such thing as crimes for presidents. As you indicated, the Supreme Court's kind of done that already. But, I argue overall, more broadly, that there's a mythology around the pardon power, that people say, oh, it's absolute, it's absolute, it's absolute. Even the Supreme Court sort of assumed that in the oral argument. The counsel for Jack Smith in the oral argument in the immunity case assumed, pardon power is absolute. It kind of made its way into the immunity opinion, but that's actually not true as a matter of law. The Supreme Court has held, for example, you can't pardon crimes that have not been committed yet. The Supreme Court has held you cannot pardon someone in violation of their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. You can't pardon them and then force them to testify, for example.
Oh, okay.
The Supreme Court has said you can't pardon someone as a president and then make the government pay back any penalty they paid into the Treasury, because that's the purse strings power, that's the appropriations power of Congress, right? So I say that the pardon power should be construed like every other provision of the Constitution, in tandem with their other parts of the Constitution. And I would say, a self-pardon to put the president above the law would be a violation of the president's duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, and it could potentially violate other parts of the Constitution. So my answer to that is no. But would this current Supreme Court, if ever faced with that, agree with me? I don't know. I think it's unlikely.
Has there ever been a movement to amend or do away with the pardon at the federal levels? And you mentioned many states don't have the same pardon. So I'm curious if states, there's a history, maybe more had the pardon and then they did away with it.
So, Kenny, this is the historian in you, and I'm going to have to follow up on this. There have been over 10,000 amendments to the Constitution, and 27 have made it. So I'm going to actually get one of my research assistants to get on that question. It's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to it. But
well, stay tuned. If I hear back from you, I'll update the episode right here.
I'm actually going to find out, right? I'm going to ask shortly.
Future editing Kenny here. Kim got back to me on this question. In 1974, then Senator and later Vice President Walter Mondale proposed a constitutional amendment after the Nixon pardon to allow Congress to disapprove clemency grants by 2/3 votes in both houses. But the amendment died in committee. Thank you for looking that up, Kim's assistant. Back to the interview. What is your greatest concern and greatest hope for the future of the pardon?
My greatest concern is that it's the shotgun in the closet, which in conjunction with immunity will turn effectively America into a dictatorship. And when I say dictatorship, one in which the rule of law is at the whim of whoever's in power, and that whim is enforced through violence. And that's quite serious. And the reason it's the shotgun in the closet is because presidents using their official power, it's hard to commit crimes all by themselves. Mm-hmm. Using their non-official power, which the Supreme Court said is still prosecutable, they pull out a handgun from their summer home and they shoot someone. That's private. But that means you're kind of a troubled person, but it's not it's not affecting the populace.
Yeah.
But if you're going to assassinate a political rival, which some of the dissenting justices raised during oral argument, you're going to have to direct someone with a gun to do it. So, an ATF agent or a member of the military. They're not covered by immunity. But if you promise them a pardon, then they'll do it for you.
Right.
So that's my concern, is that the pardon latched onto this new immunity. We just have to hope there are just good people that end up in the White House. And that's a big hope. For the most part, that's what's happened, but not always. My hope for the pardon power, like the Constitution itself, is we've seen it really tested, the Constitution. And as a result, the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania for years have been doing an empirical study. They reach out to about 3,000 people and ask them, to name the three branches of government. When I started doing this, only a third of Americans could name it. Now it's, only a fifth, and now it's up to a third. So I think we're having an increased constitutional literacy in the United States and a bigger, broader conversation about the state of our democracy, whether there should be guardrails. There were a lot of legislation that was passed post-Watergate. And so my hope is, and I have some suggestions in the book, that Congress takes this seriously and passes legislation when there is an energy to do it, and even overcoming the filibuster, to shore up these foundational principles. And I would add that changes to the pardon power could be constitutional, some of them, and disclosure, lobbying requirements, transparency, requiring accompanying records of the rationale behind a pardon, things like that to give public scrutiny so Americans know how this is working. It's not just in a flood of articles in the last day of office in a few newspapers. So that's my greatest hope, that we as Americans come together and take back some of our democracy by insisting that there be accountability for those who hold the precious power of the people.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Kimberly Wehle and want to learn more about the history of the pardon, pick up her newly released book, Pardon Power: How the Pardon System Works and Why, from your nearest bookstore. Thank you so much. This was a lovely conversation, Kim.
Thank you, Kenny. And let me also add, if I might, I have a newsletter that you can find on my website, Kim Wehle, KIMWEHLE.com, that goes out twice a week, where I have a bare bones well, it's not really bare bones. It's in my own way. I get a little deep, but it's a Q&A. It's for non-lawyers that breaks down legal news of the week. And we're going into an election season and a lot that's going on. So if you want updates, particularly in connection with having read some of my work on how to think about these issues, feel free to just join on to that.
Well, I know what I'm signing up for next. So thanks, Kim. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon, or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, how do Americans feel about taxes? And how has that changed over time? Tax law professor Michael Gratz will discuss the history of America's love-hate relationship with taxes and the services they fund, and the seismic impact Ronald Reagan had on that history. That's coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.